So I've never done this before, but I thought I want to try. I even brought a book to hold up, like
Oh, yeah,
make it
good.
professional. Maybe I
Uh,
can figure out a way to like put this on the video, but
or if they touch the screen, it immediately takes them to Amazon would be fine.
that would be good. I know you can do that, but I don't know how. Wish I could
Yeah,
do that with my own books.
I know.
Uh, all right. Diving right in. I thought I'd start out with. I had this idea for a question, but then when I thought about it, I realized it wasn't a question. It was just sort of a rambling statement, but it might spark a conversation.
Okay.
Um, I read the book and I really liked it, and I feel like I'm one of those people that you kind of castigate in the book, or I don't know, castigate, or you're kind of not so overly enthusiastic about, who left. Who grew up in Akron. Well, I grew up in Wadsworth, but moved to Akron pretty quickly, and then left. Um, and I left at the time I left. I felt like I was kind of drowning in it. Like it was this cesspool of horror. And that getting out was sort of like. It was like the Apollo rocket launch. You had to like personally had to do all this work to just make it happen and to achieve escape velocity. Um, and then I came back for about a year and a half. Lived two doors down from you, um,
That's right.
and 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 I couldn't deal with it again. Um, and then just recently, what sparked my interest in wanting to do this interview was after I read this book. About a week after I'd finished it, I went back to Akron and did that show that I told you about, that benefit show.
Great.
Um, and as soon as I hit the city limits of Akron, it was like this. I shouldn't say this publicly because I'm trying to see if I can establish a Zen center in Akron, so everybody has to forgive me. But it was like this cloud of lead. I was trying to describe it to my girlfriend, and that's what it felt like. Just descended on me, like, oh, can I carry this thing? Can I handle it? Um, so, so it's I don't know. So there's no question there, as I said, but
Well,
I wanted to talk
there,
about like staying and leaving, I suppose.
yeah, and you've actually introduced like two tenets of the defensiveness that's inherent, I think, in natives. I mean, it's interesting to me because you and I were born almost to the day in the same time and place.
Really, you're
Like
March.
you're March 1964, right?
Wow, yeah, yeah,
And Wadsworth and Akron, like a few miles apart. So our experience is really parallel.
yeah,
And there's this one thing that's happened with the book that I didn't anticipate that you just articulated is this perception that I've excoriated those who left, and I never actually did that.
yeah. I guess
But
I guess in retrospect you didn't, but yeah,
because we are a defensive people, because we in place that made us defensive. Those who left are defensive about it, and I'm defensive about the fact that I didn't excoriate you. And I've been having this conversation a lot since the book came out, which is to say that it says we are more alike than different,
yeah,
whether we stay or leave. Um, but it's what I really was trying to say in the book was not so much. I understand people who left, and it would have been easier for me to leave. And in fact, the fact that I accept LeBron James' rationale for leaving,
yeah,
even if I don't accept the way he did it, says that I'm pretty accepting.
yeah,
But really, I think what I'm trying to say is this is what it's like to have stayed and to have stuck it out and to be proud of that. Which is, being proud of that doesn't say I'm not proud of you for leaving. And you didn't exactly take the easy way out either. You went to work in Japanese horror films and
yeah,
be a rock musician.
yeah,
I mean, it's not like you got a job at an annuities firm and
yeah.
bought a Mercedes.
Not yet, but
We're working on it, right?
yeah. Oh, well.
That's next on the bucket list.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I like the other thing. One of the things that sort of I really liked about the book is what you said about Jimmy Image, the lead singer of Zero Defects. Although you didn't mention he was lead singer of Zero Defects, so I resent you for that. I'm not really, but I like that, and he's one of the people, and I guess two of the original Zero Defects left. Tommy Strange went to San Francisco and stayed, and I went to Japan, and two of them stayed, Mickey the drummer and Jimmy. And Jimmy is a real piece of Akron, I think, which I think maybe someday somebody will figure out how important he is, because he's been archiving all this this stuff, this weird Akron ephemera. I still don't have questions here.
Well, no, let's just sanctify Jimmy Image, because I think he's a pure soul. And, for a while, I think it would have been easy to say that he was a lost soul, because because people went off and did things, and Jimmy always kind of just stuck to what was important to him. Mm-hmm. And at some point, I'm like, man, that guy really, he knew who he was from the very beginning, and he was always kind of an inspiration to me, just artistically, or as somebody who was really committed to the ideals of music and lifestyle and so forth. Yeah. And now he's kind of proven that out. He's almost like you're the Zen master. You tell me but he knew his path, and he's on his path, and he just really seems to be kind of happy.
Well, he's doing his thing, and he's another one who stayed. I mean, he left for a little while. I think he was out on some Indian reservation for a while, but he came back. There's something that's kind of interesting. I was thinking about it when I was thinking about doing this interview, and maybe you have an answer. I've traveled a lot, and weirdly, when I lived in Japan, one of the first things I set about doing was writing 2 novels, which I've since self-published, but I never could find a real publisher for them. But they're all about Akron. And I was sitting there in Japan, in Tokyo, writing about Akron, Ohio, which I thought was strange even when I did it. But there's this thing about... I'll show you my T-shirt, because maybe it'll explain it. You see these?
I'll show you mine. Maybe you can explain it.
Bleh?
I don't know. I found it at the thrift store, and I'm sure it's something that, like the Black Label Education Association or something, but I like the fact that it seems to be making a statement that it didn't intend to make. Yours is making a statement that it intended to make. But, fuck you, I'm from Akron.
Yeah, and I think that embodies this sort of Akron attitude, which I don't know if I'm just not familiar with other cities, but I don't really think I've seen it anywhere else. Maybe Detroit. But this idea of, this is... you hate the city and you defend it too. I mean, hate is kind of a strong word, but there's things wrong with it, but you're still sticking up for it, and you do that in the book.
Yeah. Well, you know what? First of all, you have traveled the world, and that makes you a better person. I'm the most provincial person in the world, and I know it. And my book is sort of a pan to provincialism, but I think a positive kind of provincialism. But one thing I've noticed over many years is whenever somebody introduces themselves and says that they've recently moved to Akron, Akronites invariably will answer with one word, which is why.
Yeah, I know. That's what happened when I moved back.
I know, and it's not why would you possibly want to live here? It's not that at all. It's how did you know? How did you know that this was a good place to live?
Yeah.
And it's that attitude that your T-shirt expresses. You just don't get it, even if you left for negative reasons, you didn't think this was a good place to make your life, or you thought it was provincial or whatever. I think people, natives of places like this, still carry that protectiveness, because it's kind of it is kind of like a wounded or misshapen pet that you do feel like you have to defend, because you recognize it. I use the word in the book that I actually got from another source, but it's unbeautiful is kind of how I describe the city, and I mean that fondly, but it's not a traditionally beautiful place.
Aglotto,
But
I think, is what Mark Mothersbaugh used that word, aglotto.
a glotto.
Aglotto, like Uglatto, I think.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I like
it's kind of like that, and
yeah,
it's
exotically ugly. I think is what that word really means.
it's interesting is it's not really. When I moved back for that year and a half, I discovered that it's not. It wasn't as ugly as I thought it was. You know, in my memory, I'd made it extraordinarily rancidly horrible. You know, and I moved back and I'm like, it's not that bad. You know, there's some decent architecture. There's certainly a lot of beautiful nature around. You know, it's
Yeah.
it's not it's not a it's not that.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have a striking skyline, but then that sort of makes you look at the skyline in a different way. You know, it's like you're looking, if you're looking for Chicago's skyline, then you're looking in the wrong city. But, one of my catchphrases is that Akron has everything, but it only has one of everything.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah,
it has one tall building.
yeah, yeah,
But how many tall buildings do you need at a time?
yeah. I only
Yeah,
need one. Yeah,
yeah, that's my provincial attitude. It has one really great park, but it has more than one really great park. But but let's just say it had 50 great parks. How many parks can you be in at one time?
yeah, yeah. No, it's it's
My,
it's it's true, and it's interesting to me. I was before I set up the Skype, I was looking at some of the reviews of the book because it's interesting to see like the New York Times review and these things. How I mean, I know how I take it because I know Akron pretty intimately,
right.
and it's one thing, and it's interesting to see how people who aren't familiar with Akron take it. Did you feel like you were having to explain Akron?
Yeah, well, I was on book tour for weeks after the book came out, and mostly away from here. And yeah, I mean, that was definitely it was weird, a weird dynamic. Whenever I would do a reading in this immediate region,
Mm-hmm.
I could do a completely different reading
Yeah.
and have a completely different conversation than when I left the region. And when I say the region, I still mean within the Rust Belt, but once you get beyond sort of the shared knowledge and language of Northeast Ohio, you're telling a different version of the Rust Belt story.
Yeah.
So then I'm explaining Akron as representational of a place like Pittsburgh or cities in Michigan where I was, and and I'm going to Chicago this weekend. I mean, that's all part of the general post-industrial region, but you sort of have to explain Akron's example then, I think, in a way that needs a foundation. So then I can say, so outside this region, I say, Akron is, in a way, it's if it's not quintessential, it's at least an extremely clean model of a Rust Belt city,
Yeah.
because we had, for one thing, it's positioned geographically and economically directly at the epicenter of what is defined as the Rust Belt.
Mm-hmm.
But additionally, it's the only city that I know of that was uniquely of a single industry. The rubber industry was only here, and it was almost completely here. And so it imploded almost completely, especially in terms of middle class lifestyles that were based on that industry. And so when you take a city that's industrial and then you just remove the vast majority of what that industry is, then you've got rust, and it can sort of define its patterns moving forward in a clean way. Whereas Cleveland had steel, I mean, that was its big industry, and steel never left. There's still a working steel mill in Cleveland, and so Cleveland's never been able to kind of see what it's like to move completely forward.
Well, I think Detroit is really similar. Whenever I try to explain Akron, I usually reference Detroit because people know Detroit better, and I say, well, how the car industry left Detroit. It's the same time, around the same time.
GM's still there, and so much of the industry is still there. But if you talk about people who get up and go to build cars, then you're talking about a big part of it. People don't get up and go build cars in Detroit the same way they used to.
There's a couple of things I could go with. I had a friend when I was living in California. I had a friend who would get really annoyed if I started talking about Ohio, because he'd go, "Oh yeah, salt of the earth, yeah, whatever," because he was born and raised in Los Angeles, and he was really
Right.
annoyed at Midwesterners because there's a lot of ex-Midwesterners, a lot of ex-Akron people in
Yeah.
California who will poo-poo Los Angeles and say, I'm salty. How do you feel about that kind of thing? Do you think there is a difference
Well,
between people from that?
there's a writer, an obscure-ish Ohio writer named Don Powell, who has this great quote: "All Americans come from Ohio, if only briefly."
Yeah.
And if you think about it, I mean, in a way, Ohio is as American a place as there is. I mean, there's a reason that so much attention is focused on this state during presidential elections. And partly it's because of electoral college numbers, but it's also, I wrote about this in the book, that in the 1990s, the New York Times did a bunch of demographic number crunching and so forth, and determined that the most quintessentially American city in America was Canton, Ohio. And they sent this feature writer, Michael Weinrip, to live in Canton for a year, the year of the presidential election. And he moved his family here, he enrolled his kids in the schools, and he just took on the life of a Canton, Ohioan, to be a true American.
Yeah.
And so there's something about that attitude that I find interesting. I mean, I remember when I would go to New York when I still smoked, and it was when the smoking bans were first going into place. And so everybody who smoked would be huddled in the doorway, and invariably in those doorways I'd say, "Where are you from?" And the person would be from Ohio, and then of course the stereotype is all Ohioans smoke.
Yeah.
But my publicist at Scribner is from Mansfield, Ohio originally, not an hour from here, and she is she's in New York publishing. She moves in the big circles of that and goes to the Paris Review parties and so forth. And she said and she's really defensive because she said she was asked one time, because she's very fashionable. She looks great, and somebody said, "Oh, you dress so well. Were you able to get fashion magazines on the farm?" And if you're from like Mansfield is not far.
No.
It's a really easy target, I think, for people who want to make themselves feel a little bit bigger, and in that way, it's, I guess, if you're going to pick an easy target, it makes an easy one, but there goes our defensiveness again too, right?
Yeah. Well, Ohio's, it's interesting because it's more urban than people imagine. When I lived in Chicago for a couple of years, and people were constantly, "Are you from Iowa? Or Idaho?" Like, it's
which
not,
is weird because I always feel like
really
Chicago
different.
really gets it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you were there longer, and you probably had a different.
Well,
nuance.
people just do that, and
Yeah.
and I don't know if I think there's a difference, but it was really interesting reading the book because it was a lot of things I remember. Like you talk about, was it your friend John had the place in was it in it's Goodrich, right?
It's in the old Goodrich, or was in the old Goodrich complex. Yeah.
Yeah, I was in a band with the ex-drummer of Zero Defects, and we played one gig, and it was there. It was in that little art space.
Yeah.
There, that was like off to the right side of the driveway, right? Am I thinking of the right place?
Exactly.
Because you drove in. And then I went to that night, what was that called? Maybe that nightclub they had down there briefly that was just like anytime a band played in it, it just sounded like, whoa.
It was huge, because everything about that complex was huge, because it was made for, manufacturing. It was called, was it Satchmo's?
Maybe it was, yeah.
Satchmo's.
But then every time I went to
be a
that
jazz
place,
club, but in Akron you can't specialize.
No.
So if it's going to be a jazz club, there are going to be rock bands there.
Sure. But that was interesting because you did a lot more exploring than I ever did. I did a couple of those things, like when going to Satchmo's. The thing you could do was you could wander through the whole Goodrich plant because they hadn't really there was no real barriers that I remember. You know, you just open a
Right.
door and all of a sudden you're in there. You know.
Yeah, in that moment when they first, because as the book tells, that whole 40-acre complex of 40 plus buildings was slated for demolition, and so when it first, and it went to the 11th hour and was saved, and nobody knew exactly what to do with it. So when it was first kind of in its moment of conversion, nobody gave a shit. It was just like life, any kind of life was welcomed, and so it was so you could like really kind of get into these spaces, and it was ghostly because you would go into a space that not long before had been an actively operating factory, and you would just find remnants of the last day there, things that people just left laying around or whatever, and so it was really like this odd human connection to something that was dead, but still kind of there. And like going back to our previous line of conversation, this for people of a certain age who are curious, I mean, the story of going out and seeing the world, that's the American story, right?
Yeah.
You set off and to find the world, and I think an underrepresented version of that is people who go off exploring in their own place.
Yeah.
Because the idea of provincialism is that you just stay home and you never experience anything beyond your own very immediate circle. And the longer you stay, the more tight that circle stays. But I know a lot of people, our age, who continue to explore, and yet stay in the same place. I mean, I go to Cleveland regularly to do things, and and I know a lot of people who do that, and so I think that's part of the story too, is continuing to discover and rediscover.
I think that's really good, because I mean it's sort of is like something that happens in my line of work, which is people want to. There's a sort of exoticness of Zen or meditation that people want to jet off somewhere, and people sort of assume I did that. But I didn't really. My first 10 years of studying Zen was in Kent, in Kent, Ohio.
Yes, the faraway exotic
of
Kent, Ohio.
And the thing is, like, I always tell people, like, try to discover what's right around you, because I think that's really important, and that's one of the things I really like about your book is just this kind of idea that maybe there's a lot of exoticness or a lot of interesting things right in front of you.
Yeah,
that you
I mean,
just pass by.
I'm sure there are millions of Parisians for whom Paris is mundane.
Yeah.
It's just. We're there, and I'm sure there are plenty of Akronites like me who get excited, to find something new, or find Akron newly exotic in its own way. I mean, one of the things I this is one of the stories I like to tell outside of here, is I remember I was in Pittsburgh and I said, you know what the Goodyear blimp is, don't you? That's that thing that flies over the Super Bowl once a year, and they're like, yeah, and I'm like, you know what? At my house, the Goodyear blimp is the thing that flies over on Tuesday afternoon. Take that.
So take that. Yeah. Well, Jeff's song, the We Got the Blimp.
We got the blimp. I know. I'm in that video.
Oh, that's right. You are. I forgot you're in that video.
That was That's my Hollywood moment.
I see the blimp high in the sky. I raise my fist and salute it, 'cause I know we got the blimp. The blimp guides us and protects us, and there is security knowing we got the blimp.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting character too, because he writes all these songs about Akron. That
there's another pure soul, man. True
you
to
can't understand unless you're from Akron.
I know.
Which limits
I hate Route 8, huh?
Yeah,
What?
I hate Route 8. No, nobody's going to get that. But, I have a t-shirt. I have one of those t-shirts about no parking on the Devil's Strip, that they sell.
Right. Yeah.
What's the name of that place downtown? But
Rubber City Clothing.
Rubber City Clothing, that's right.
Yeah. They did a whole line of t-shirts designs for this book.
Oh, cool.
Which was really cool. It was their idea, and the guy who owns it asked for an advance copy, and I gave him one. And like a day later, he had all these sketches. It was like great. They're really cool. There's an 8675309 design and a bowling pin and rubber snow boot.
I mean that's interesting. There's a lot of stories you bring up that I hadn't heard, like the hot dog, or not the hot dog, the hamburger was invented in Akron, and the connection with the Converse high tops, Chuck Taylor. I had no idea. That's all interesting stuff.
Yeah, and part of that was to illustrate how that aspect that I think is universal of. Especially in places that are not kind of celebrities themselves, which, very few cities are cities that have their own celebrity. I mean, Los Angeles and New York are the exceptions. Most places are very, like, self-aware and hyper-aware of their links to uniqueness. Yeah. So almost any city that has a notable celebrity, when you mention something to that person, if you're a stranger, they'll say, "Oh, so-and-so is from here."
Yeah.
So, I forget I had some examples in the book. I forget where Bob Eubanks is from, but
Bob Eubanks
from that city will say, Bob Eubanks is from here.
Yeah.
Like that's a thing.
And we've got some odd celebrities, though, that come out of Akron. I mean, the oddest being Devo, I think. But then
who's made odder, I think, by like LeBron James. I mean, when you put those two in the same basket, then you go, "Oh yeah, Akron. That's the city that produced, Jim Jarmusch and LeBron James."
Yeah.
What do they have in common?
Yeah, it is weird, and I kind of often wondered why. I mean, you can kind of see the Akron thing in Devo's music, but I mean, I briefly met Bob too. God, rest his soul. Mm-hmm. And because he was, it's hard to talk about him in past tense. Anyway, he was a friend of mine in L.A. and this was about the time I was going to move back to Akron, and he said, he gave the typical response like, "Why would you do that?" and so did Buzz Click of the Rubber City Rebels. He was incredulous that I would. What the hell are you thinking?
Like the Rubber City Rebels shouldn't thank their lucky stars that Akron embraced them, especially the second time around. Come on, man.
Yeah. What's interesting, how do these people come out of there? The Black.
Well, this is one of the parts of Akron's history. It's the part that I find the most interesting, and that I continue to find interesting, is this whole sort of subgeneration of people from a very specific moment, which would be Devo, Chrissy Hind, Jim Jarmusch, but also Rita Dove, the poet. They're all born, Robert Quine, born within, and Ralph Carney, within a couple years of each other. And, a lot of people point to Ghoulardi as a big influence on them, and they do too. But you couldn't say that's the only thing. Ghoulardi, for people who are watching this who don't know, was this bizarre late night B-movie host who used like really cool like surf and rockabilly and garage rock as his background, and they had this sick humor, weird sort of hipster spiel that was kind of schlocky, but also kind of like sarcastic, and and he was just locally huge. When there were only 3 channels, there was a huge audience for any channel at any one time. So so they were all influenced by him, but there had to be something else. I mean, it had to be, and I think some of it was just like that was at the time when industry and the hierarchy was at its peak. And so even for not like directly anarchic, rebellious teenagers, just that idea that there's something over us, it makes the underground easier to define. And then, and it's easier to be a bored teenager, I think, in a place like Akron, Ohio, because, it's a boring place for a teenager, especially at that time. So I think a lot of that spawned a lot of that music and art and that attitude. But I don't know. But then then some of it just doesn't compute. Some of it just seems like it was just like a kind of a magical moment.
Yeah, there's a Ghoulardi story that I sometimes I try to tell in my talks, but it takes so much explaining of who Ghoulardi was.
Yeah.
But it might be interesting to you as well. I don't know. It's I saw an interview with Ernie Anderson, who was Ghoulardi, and this is the '90s, I suppose. It was years and years after the Ghoulardi thing, and I think it was Chuck Shadowski interviewing him, but he's saying, what is there anything you'd like to do in life that you haven't? He was a bazillionaire towards the end of his life, right? You know this, but maybe the viewers at home don't. But he was the
voice of ABC, the
Love Boat and stuff. He made tons of money, and you see pictures of his house. He lived in this great house in Hollywood and all that in the hills up there. And they said, is there anything you'd like to do that you haven't accomplished? And he said, well, I always wanted to be, and I always wanted to get like an acting role, like a small part in a film that everybody would remember. Wouldn't have to be a starring role, but just a little role that everybody would remember me for. He said that. And I just thought, I'm just like going, duh, because he did, he did it, and it was Ghoulardi, but somehow he himself didn't recognize that he'd done that.
Everything I've read and heard, he left here, and he was part of what was beautiful about him is the reason he was such a wild man. He was trying to get fired. He was the weatherman. And he didn't want to do the movie role, so he tried to do it in such a fucked up way that they would fire him, and it backfired on him, which is such an Akron, Cleveland thing to do. Like to try to screw up, to succeed by accident is easier here than to succeed on purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the spirit of the title, is to do things the hard way on purpose. So he became like this still existing icon because he would ride his motorcycle into the studio and do all this stuff. And he just kept getting more and more popular. Yeah. So when he left here, it's just kind of like, I was trying to get away from that anyway. And then, of course, he, exactly like you say, he made it for real in Hollywood. But that's his legacy. And he never, I think, understood how endearingly embraced he was and still was here at the end of his life. I think he was like, why would you be interested in that? Because I have this video, this guy, what's his name?
It might be Joe
I can't think of one of his worshipers from here went and interviewed him.
Oh, okay, yeah, I think I've seen that video. Okay.
And I don't know why I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name. But it was like kind of like that, like, why would you fly all the way from Cleveland to Los Angeles to interview me about something that I only did for a short time, before my real career began?
Yeah.
It's that divide between his legacy, which, I don't know, we build our own myths, I think, Harvey Pekar is one that I find really interesting. I mean, Harvey Pekar is probably vaguely recognized as a cult figure in other places, mostly because it was on David Letterman.
Yeah.
But in Cleveland, he's the poet laureate of Cleveland. I mean, I think that would be a universally agreed upon thing. And
he was an amazing guy too, and a kind of an amazing example of what you can do. Well, good. There's one thing I wanted to sort of mention that has nothing to do with the interview, but it's something. Have you seen that book, Detroit Rock City? Like an oral history of the Detroit rock and roll scene?
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
Somebody should do that for Akron. So I was going to say, if you want a project, there you go. But cool. I really appreciate you doing this. I'm going to figure out how to edit it down. Well, I probably won't edit much, but just, trim the front and back and make it into something, and I'll let you know when I put it up. This will be the first video interview I've done. Maybe I can do it as a regular
the flagship of the Skype empire.
Yeah, but cool. I'm glad the book is doing so well. I got a cat here, just leaned over.
Oh my god!
Yeah, he just leaned over the screen. Don't do that.
It would be hilarious if something catastrophic happened right now and this went viral for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, well, that would be typical, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I'm glad the book is doing well, and maybe somebody
Thanks.
will make a movie out of it.
Yeah, go for it.
I should get Piruz, the guy who did the movie about me, see if he wants to option it.
Yeah. You can be my stand-in.
Yeah.
At least with the graininess of Skype, we look close enough.
Yeah.
Stunt double.
I could get a wig or something. A curly wig. Well, cool.
All right. Hey, let me just say, a big Akron clown farewell to all the hardcore Zen people out there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Real. Keep it real.
We'll talk to you later.